Yeah, I mean, as you may have read, in the north of England here, the government has overruled the local council to say fracking shall happen. And there's a huge amount of protest. So this is just the sort of thing those people could be doing, isn't it? So we're probably worse than burning coal by doing fracking.
Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, I'm admittedly interested in creating as much conversation as possible. Carlos is on the line from Mexico, and just wondering if Carlos, he had a really nice comment in chat. He talked about there were several times where people had ideas and passion, but they needed to get more information and they needed to find the right partner who's an expert. And so he talked a lot about this idea of connecting investigators and scientists. And that kind of matchmaking seems particularly complex. And I'm wondering if either of you have seen examples of I took Jeff's example as he really is enabling people who've already started a movement at some level. And I'm wondering what about all of the kind of outliers or people who are latent investigators, I guess you could call them, but don't really even know where to start.
I think it's a tough one. I think, I mentioned in response to the question that people often don't share a common vocabulary. And a lot of times you see people sort of talking past one another. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. One issue is where do we sort of commonly agree that the problem we're trying to solve, like in what domain do we sort of commonly agree that it exists? And often I think when there's an overlap of interest between communities doing environmental work and people looking to apply new technologies and new ideas to problems. Sometimes I feel like the problem space gets sort of stuck in the technology domain, which is to say it quickly becomes a technology problem instead of an environmental problem. And that can be a real challenge. It's not to say that it's not both. I mean, that's really the big message here, is that there are often a technology can be this sort of opening to get some leverage in an environmental issue. But if it quickly becomes a problem which is mainly negotiated in the language of, say, electronics or sensor calibration, then already you need to be aware that a lot of people who could bring a lot to the table to solve that problem may not have the vocabulary to communicate and participate, and vice versa. If it doesn't create an opening or an explicit point of engagement for people who do have that vocabulary and do have some of those expertises, then you might have the opposite problem. So I think that's the hard part, is that I think someone said earlier, it's a cultural issue. It definitely is. People aren't used to sort of seeding, I guess, not seeding, but kind of acknowledging that the problem space is many more sided, and that someone else may have information that could be complementary with your own. It's hard to even sum up exactly how to get around this. Yeah. I think in some ways, Public Lab tries to be a sort of a third space in that regard, in order to try to not exist in a formal lab and not exist, not be hostile to the language of formal science or vice versa. But yeah, it's an ongoing challenge.
And it's made harder. I mean, I think a woman, a farmer or a subsistence farmer in Bangladesh or a place like that was mentioned earlier. I mean, that person does not want to address climate change. They have much more pressing challenges for tomorrow, right? I mean, which includes how to put food on the table, how to prevent the ocean from salinating your fields. And I think that we shouldn't assume that even if the distal cause is climate change related, that addressing the challenge will necessarily be done in the language of the climate action movement. So
complicated.
Yeah, and I think for scientists coming into a a community-based citizen science initiative, that's something that is outside of the normal experience of citizen science, that you would have to maybe appreciate or accept the fact that a project with goals that you didn't personally define might go in directions that you're not prepared for, that you didn't anticipate. And so, for instance, if the farmer in Bangladesh wants to, you know, use the data that they might collect for a citizen science project in order to make an argument in court, and then that results in them leaving their farm, then the collection of data at that site will cease. And perhaps the scientist has done a good thing by helping the farmer, you know, improve their situation, but they might not get a traditional research publication out of it. And so that's, I mean, that's again this cultural issue of, are scientists okay with that going into a project? And I would hope that some are, but it's definitely a shift in perspective.
Jeff, do you have something to say to that? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to just add, and maybe this is another angle adding complexity, but I actually think climate science is one of the hardest to do. It's one of the biggest challenges because the cycle is so big. When we talk about something like a runoff issue that's affecting a waterway that people depend on, the scope of that problem is already quite large. I mean, runoff can go, say, if you're talking about, say, Louisiana, you might be talking about agricultural runoff that's all the way up to Mississippi. But with climate change, we're talking about a global system, and so it's harder to draw a tight feedback loop between information at a given point collected by a given group of people and any change that you can measure upon the whole system. And that's not to say that it's you shouldn't do it. Obviously, it's a problem, and obviously we're feeling the effects of it. But drawing that more immediate feedback loop is harder in the model that Public Lab has pursued. Now, there are other ways to approach this. There are other ways to connect the dots. There are other ways to quantify the inputs and the outputs. But that's been a challenge, I think, and one of the reasons that Public Lab has tended to focus on local scale pollution rather than global scale pollution. You know, not for lack of interest. The other thing I wanted to say was one way that I think we've begun to try to break apart and try to scaffold a more positive or constructive dialogue between groups that speak different languages is actually to peel apart statements a little bit and try to get people to ask specific questions separate from the answers that they're proposing. So that seems kind of odd, but like often on Public Lab, we've seen people, and just in general, people report about what they've done, you know, tell about a project they've done without clearly stating the question that they were trying to solve with this project. And although that may seem like a really obvious and maybe even sort of retrograde thing to ask everyone to do, by asking people to not just break them apart, but actually just leave a little space between the question and the answer, what it does is it allows other people to get in there and say, I have a similar question that might be met by that same answer, or I have a distinct question that may change the nature of the answer. And it just creates a little bit of space for dialogue between what you recognize as the question you're trying to answer and the answer that you're bringing to the table. And we also have found that this has helped a lot because it, in some scenarios, when you present a project, if it's not explicitly clear to everybody, acknowledging that we have different vocabularies and different backgrounds, what question you are trying to answer, it may be mistaken that the solution you're proposing or the way forward that you're proposing is more broadly applicable than you're claiming. So there's sort of two sides to that. We're just trying to make sure that people don't think that there's a silver bullet just because something has worked in one place. It doesn't mean that it's going to work in yours. But also, it really is about that dialogue. And it's actually hard, if you think about a statement you've made, an assertion or a presentation you've given, to step back and say, I'm going to acknowledge that this is not the only answer to this question, or this is not the only question that this answer addresses. So I think that's sort of one strategy we've employed.
I like that, the last two sentences, excellent.
any other participant questions? It would be wonderful if we could get a couple more.
Yeah, we heard from Emmy and M. Riley just about revising our incentive systems for scientists. And we also have somebody who just raised their hand. Just a moment. So I'm going to, somebody's going to join us named Dee Rochelo. Hopefully. Hello, or Dr. Oshlo, or you're on mute, so you'll need to unmute your screen, which is, there you go.
Yeah, it's Diane Rochelo. How are you? I'm a professor at Clark University, and I've been working in citizen science and community science, maybe practicing without a license and without a title of that sort for a long time, including in Kenya, in the Dominican Republic, and also with my urban ecology class in the US. And I'm interested in the fact that Jeff brought in the STS literature and some of Sandra Harding's points about objectivity and about, you know, the locus of authority in science. I think it's really crucial to keep that in mind, and also to think about the science that people are actually already doing, and to recognize that as a first step, and to recognize the knowledge that people have already as a first step, even if they don't. Even to show curiosity and honestly actually learn something about things that people are grappling with that have to do with a broad environmental question, for example. And if your interest then is climate change, you might be looking at some of the dimensions of their lives, as you mentioned in the case of Bangladesh, but there could be many. You could be working with bird watchers in Massachusetts, for example. Richard Primack just said on the radio a couple days ago on WBUR that we have hardly any birds around right now. All the migratory birds left because of the drought. Talking to people who are out there looking at something already that interests them, or going into a school and talking to kids whose parents are not bird watchers and engaging them in thinking about birds or some other element in their environment that might be undergoing change, that they might take an interest in, or why the trees are changing color at a different time this year. And Primack says it's not climate change, it's just a drought this time, but it shows us what climate change-driven drought might be bringing to us and the rest of the world in the future. It's just an example, but I think the key point is really about recognizing the depth and validity of people's own experience and working from that, starting with it, and making sure that you've got a broad spectrum of people involved as well. I know that Public Lab does some really stellar stuff. I don't know if Jeff could address that, but in New York City, just going out into the park in Prospect Park and doing balloon mapping, and suddenly having an engaged public there in a part of the city. That's another thing that people can do. But I just wonder if there aren't more examples. I'm sure other people tuned in may have examples of how they've worked with people in place, and how one might begin to get people interested in being networked into a larger conversation without being driven by it. I'll just stop there.
I'm glad you caught me. I was citing early 80s STS, and my friends in the STS fields sometimes make fun of me for being way out of date. But one of my favorite texts from around that period, I think maybe a little later, was The Science of the Lambs, which is a paper on, maybe you know it as well. Oh, sorry, Science, Technology, and Society is the field, and it's related to the history of science and logically and historically speaking. Although I'm going to step into a minefield with people who are actually in that field if I say much more. But I was going to reference this Science of the Lambs article, which I read as an undergraduate, and I was very inspired by. It recognizes in some ways and discusses the difficulty of communication and collaboration between scientists and Cumbrian sheep farmers who were trying to understand the effects and risks of Chernobyl fallout on water and grass and the sheep that were grazing, and the gaps, you know, between them and the sort of misses and talking past one another in that scenario. I should go back and reread it because it was such an inspiration to me. But it really does highlight some of the difficulties of working. And I guess I also, yeah, I mean, you mentioned highlighting the experience that people already have of doing science. It recalled to mind another situation that I'd heard of. We've worked a little bit with folks in West Virginia who are in the mountain justice movement, and some of them have done bucket brigade air grab sampling, where you collect a bucket of air and you send it to a lab for analysis. And there's a couple really interesting things about that. I had heard that some of the groups there would not submit a bucket, an air grab sample, to an in-state lab because the presumption. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm mixing things up. The Louisiana Bucket Brigade would not submit to an in-state lab. The West Virginian Bucket Brigades, I had heard that they would submit a sample with a known contaminant or absence of contaminant to a lab in order to test the lab to make sure that that lab would find contamination where they knew it to be. And I think that's both inspiring in the sense that it's a testing of the testers by community groups, but it's also depressing that community groups that face such urgent issues of health and exposure don't trust labs and potentially shouldn't trust labs enough, resulting in them spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars to send already known samples through a lab just to know that that lab is going to give them an accurate result. So that's something that I always think of when I hear questions about validity in citizen science. I know there are a lot of challenges to people collecting data in a way that's consistent and rigorous and well documented, but I think that the questions of validity come from both sides. So that's one where I really liked that people were doing science on scientists.
Yeah, and there's no better example of that than the Flint water contamination from last year. To speak to some of the comments from Jeff and Diane, as well as the ones online, it's definitely something that comes up for a lot of scientists that have worked in the far north regions up in the Arctic, where they really have no other choice than to work with the local communities because they're the only people who live out there and they know the land so well in a way that scientists who airdrop in once a year will never understand. And so some of the scientists who work in regions like that have really tried hard to establish these relationships of mutual trust with the communities that they're working with, not just so that they have permission to enter their land and hopefully, maybe even get some data from them when they're not there, but so that they're respecting the way that the local people use their land and they're producing information that's useful to them. So there is some precedent for that sort of activity already in the scientific community, but it's sort of come up in an ad hoc manner based on where your research project is.
I see one question that's been posted online. It's a tough question. I'm going to just read it out. Zhengman Liu is asking us, a physicist said, imagination is more important than knowledge. What thing or any others do you think is more important in climate science? And then how do you redesign the definition? Thanks. But I think the question is climate science driven more by hard analysis or by imaginative leaps? And I'm not sure if this is a proper question for a community science webinar, but I think we can still try to address it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just from my own perspective, I would offer that climate science in the early days, you know, say the 60s or the even earlier than that, was driven by the same sort of curiosity that drove any other research. It was all based on the physics of the climate system and how heat exchanges between the atmosphere and the ocean and all of the, you know, consequences of that. I think as scientists realized the magnitude of the effects that these changes were having on the Earth system, it became sort of a hybrid of curiosity about how the world works combined with a desire to answer these really urgent questions about how are things like agricultural systems going to respond to these changes. So I think it's still sort of in development, but it's definitely driven by both of those objectives.
Okay. So let's come back again. We have about 10 minutes left in this conversation. Do we want to talk about a couple of specific ways in which people could start doing climate-related community science? I know that we mentioned a couple of very simple water-related exercises that people could do. Both Britta and Jeff, whatever you want to say, that would be great.
Yeah, maybe you want to go for this, Jeff?
Sure. Yeah, actually, you know, I find that I have almost changed a little bit over the course of the conversation in what I wanted to pose as a challenge. Don't panic, Rajesh. I'm still just the same one. I'll paste this in. This is what I was going to suggest, is that people check out this page about this project called the Koki. And a lot of people in Public Lab have been involved in this project. In some ways, it's sort of like an attempt at the simplest case of, you know, how to combine a range of questions about water, the challenges of developing an experiment and a new method, or at least a newly DIY version of an existing method, and about how to adapt that to a specific problem. It touches on many sides of this. It touches on questions of calibration, of repeatability of data collection that measures the conductivity of water. And so it's actually a pretty good place to have that kind of conversation, because it's a relatively straightforward, because although it's simple, you find that it's not as straightforward as you might imagine, given how simple the basic activity of collecting connectivity data with sensors is. Now, I'm going to still say, I think there's some really good activities and points where you could try to build one of these. It costs about $5 in parts. You can try out some of these activities. They walk you through plugging it in, measuring temperature, and then actually making a solution out of, I think one of the examples is like putting potato chips into water and it gets salty, and measuring the salty water compared to plain tap water. There's a bunch of really good activities. I would encourage you to try them. But actually, insofar as I want to propose a really clear point of engagement, I'm going to post the questions page. What we did at Public Lab is we have a Q&A system, and we've actually put it at publiclab.org/questions. And sort of referring to what I mentioned earlier about separating out what is a question and what is an answer, we're really trying to make a resource online where people can ask questions which get at immediate needs that they have. And I see a lot of these sorts of questions in the comments from participants here. So if there's one thing that I'd like to ask people to do, is take one of the questions you have here and post it on publiclab.org. And what we're trying to do is create a space where, I mean, Public Lab encompasses 5,000 to 10,000 people from such radically different backgrounds that we don't always even share a spoken language. We're going to try to get lots of people to look at these questions and propose answers and sort of debate them and see what we can come up with. Which is not to say that we will find an answer to every question, but we're going to try.
Britta, do you have any challenge questions or any suggestions here?
Well, I guess it would, just for people who are, listening to a webinar like this and who are already interested in this kind of thing, to just think about what sort of, for you and your community, what sort of questions do you have that science might be able to help address? And if you could design your own community science project, what would that look like? Because I think if people are having that internal dialogue and hopefully going beyond that and talking to their friends and their family about what sort of issues they might be facing locally, that's the first step in then connecting with scientists to actually do some research and help answer those questions. And you might find that there are already resources out there that meet your needs, but more than likely there are not. And so that's the point where you would need to either reach out to a scientist or find a group like Public Lab and try to search around for more resources to make something like that tractable.
Excellent. Wonderful. It's 12:56. We are closing in 4 minutes. And Mark, if you want to come back on, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, before closing out, I thought there was a good question that showed up in the chat. And I think it's kind of the tail end of what Britta just said, which is farmers in countries like India, Bangladesh don't really care about scientific advancement and climate change. They care about their crops and employment. So can you, Britta, kind of continue that thread that you were just on in speaking about people who are just extremely locally oriented and locally minded, and how they can actually connect with scientists, or is that even a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a simple answer to that.
Yeah.
I think what we're talking about here is trying to encourage both scientists and the public to take a broader view of what science can accomplish.
Yeah.
From the perspective of someone from, say, a farmer in India or Africa who has some immediate challenge that they're facing, say, drought, which is hurting them in their ability to sell their crops. Yeah, obviously they aren't going to be that interested in collecting temperature or rainfall data and sending it off to some database and having no idea what happens to it. So what I hope scientists are doing more in the future is not just reaching out to communities when they need something, but getting to know people in areas that they're interested in and figuring out what their concerns are. And so that you're not just hopping on some event that happens like a drought, but you have an established, mutually respectful relationship with a local community, and they see the value of working with you, hopefully from establishing some kind of long-term data set or putting them in touch with their local policymakers or local government in a way that they couldn't do on their own, that will produce some sort of tangible benefit for them in the long run. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that can happen with just one single project or 1 year of data that won't really meet people's needs. So.
My sense is that, for example, in the health world, again, where there are concerns that are directly important to people, it's still been very hard to establish those kinds of ongoing relationships of both on the data collection side when you're a scientist, but delivering public goods on the side of the end user. And it's a difficult challenge, and systems always struggle.
So Rajesh, as you say, we're near the end. Before people start dropping off, Dave had a great idea that I alluded to in the beginning. One of the things that we're trying to do here is just help people there's a lot of people who are members of Climate X, and we'd love to help them, if they share common interests, get connected to each other. So as Dave says in the chat, if everybody before they leave could just write down, and maybe there'll be this flood of chat all of a sudden, the 1 or 2 topics they'd most like to connect with others in the Climate X community about, just popping that in, we'll save this chat, and that can really help us in terms of organizing both future webinars, but also getting people in touch with each other. So that's the request. Just submit. There we go. Thank you, Dan. Please write down 1 or 2 topics that you'd like to connect with the Climate Act community about. And with that, I think we've reached the end of this webinar. Thank you very much to Jeff and Britta. That was really, really informative, very interesting. Thank you also to Robert and I'm sorry, Dr. Rochelot from
Diane.
Diane, thank you. So unless anyone has any other questions, Rajesh, do you want to have any closing thoughts?
I just think that, again, this is a topic where we can keep talking for a long, long time. And I just want to throw out the possibility that in the IAP session, which we are planning a more extended community science engagement, but in person, hopefully. So if you are in the Boston area, we might be able to bring people together in person to start thinking more hands-on on how we can do community climate science.
Very inspiring get-together.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Bye.